I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Zelensky finally announces his victory plan to Parliament, we assess fast-moving military developments as Ukraine faces pressure on multiple fronts, and then sit down with a 29-year-old commander of a frontline attack drone unit.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 16th of October, 2 years and 240 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant, Lieutenant Yulia Mykytenko, her biographer, Lara Marlowe, and to assist with translation, Nazir Yatshishin. First though, over to Roland for a summary of frontline movements over the past 24 hours.
Good morning, Francis. As is our custom, we'll start with the usual kind of clockwise assessment of the battlefront, starting at, roughly 12 o'clock, the most northerly-easterly point, which is, of course, Kursk Oblast inside Russia, where Ukraine is fighting its own offensive since August. Now, the kind of headline you'll see, I think, on our website and our paper this morning is that there are credible reports Russia's now retaken roughly half of the territory initially seized by Ukraine during its incursion into Kursk in August. Now, that comes from several sources. One of them is Russian. It's Abti Aludinov, the Chechen commander of Akhmat Spetsnaz. He said yesterday that approximately half of the territory that was occupied by the enemy has been liberated. He said now. That does actually chime with Institute of the Study of War, which says it's observed visual evidence that says the Russians have recaptured roughly 46% of the territory, so in the same kind of ballpark. And we've got other assessments from other think tanks along those lines. Now, this isn't a sudden thing. It's not as if the Ukrainian lines have collapsed. You can actually track an incremental Russian advances in Kursk since, roughly around the middle of September, but there's definitely been reported a sizable, more significant advance in roughly the last week, specifically on the western or left hand from the Ukrainian perspective side of the salient. It's kind of around the town of Glushkovo, southwest of the Russian town of Glushkovo. Now, Ukrainian Center for Defense Strategies, it's a Kiev-based think tank. It's in its update for the 24 hours up to yesterday evening, it said Russia had put in another 26 attacks at various points around the salient, but that all were repelled. But it also said, without giving a specific timeline, and I think they're kind of summarizing things that have happened over, in recent days or something, because this chimes with reports we've seen kind of building up. The Russian forces have recently retaken Tosty Lug, Novy Put, the little villages, the area near Novoivanovka, Borki, Plehova, and they've continued offensive actions, which means they're still pushing but haven't necessarily advanced near Kremenoe, Lubimovka, Zilony Shalek, Novovanka, Fanevseyevka, and are displacing, so currently, this was reported last night, displacing Ukrainian units from the village of Visola. I'm not going to bore you by kind of giving you a verbal account of where each of those villages is around the salient, but it gives you a sense of the kind of weight of the battle there at the moment. It does seem like the Russians are making some progress there. The CDS puts the Ukrainian difficulties partly down to environmental conditions. It says in Kursk Oblast, the onset of autumn rains has begun. The use of Russian tracked vehicles gives them an advantage over Ukrainian wheeled vehicles in such conditions. I must say that's consistent with blog posts from some both Ukrainian and Russian bloggers in recent times talking about that, particularly up there in Kursk. Remember, fairly open country up there, usual stuff with tree lines and windbreaks, but not a huge amount of cover. Now, I want to stay in Kursk because we've got another potentially very significant update here. I'm going to caveat it. These claims come from two Ukrainian media outlets, Liga.net and Suspilne, and they're both quoting anonymous Ukrainian security sources. We've been unable to immediately verify this ourselves, so take it with that kind of caveat. However, the claim is from these Ukrainian security sources that Russia's 11th Air Assault Brigade is raising a special battalion staffed by North Koreans. Now, there's a few things to unpack here. They call it a special Buryat battalion. Now that I suppose you could call it racist. That's because Buryats from the Russian Siberian Republic of Buryatia look East Asian. They're East Asian appearance. So I suppose that's why the Russians are saying, they're going to say these are Buryats. They're not actually Koreans. I suppose that's the Russian way of passing it off. But anyway, they're saying it's a special Buryat battalion. It's going to be staffed by North Korean troops. There'll be about 3,000 troops in it, so actually much bigger than a regular battalion. So really you should use the term battalion in quotation marks here. And their intelligence, they say, is that it's to be deployed to fight in Kursk region and to defend the border. Now, as I said, we can't immediately verify these claims, but it would technically fit with the terms of a mutual defence pact that Russia signed with North Korea earlier this summer, which did commit either country to come to the aid of the other if attacked. So you could. It does seem likely, if this is confirmed, that Russia is seeking to use these North Koreans to fight against the Ukrainian advance in Kursk, to guard the border, and that way free up other units for operations inside Ukraine. And I think there's another thing here, which isn't, apart from the fact that's really significant, if North Korea is genuinely becoming a combatant as well as supplying a lot of ammunition to the Russians. It says something also about Vladimir Putin's own policy. I mean, this is very consistent with his well-established reluctance against launching a new wave of mobilization to address manpower issues. I mean, he's tried since the beginning of the war to somehow fight this war without explicitly breaking his supposed social contract with the Russian public. You know, he's tried to avoid sending conscripts into combat in Ukraine. They are fighting in Kursk Oblast. There's been a bit of a backlash. There is some talk about Russia changing the law, actually, to say that if you're a conscript and if you've ended up fighting inside Russia, then you'll get the same fairly generous social benefits as an official war veteran, which seems to be a way to address that. But again, turning to North Korea for troops does look like another element of this Russian reluctance to actually go for a full-out mobilization that we've seen for a long time from the Russians. And just to put this in context, as we reported on Monday, the previous day on Sunday, Volodymyr Zelensky first publicly claimed that North Korea was sending soldiers as well as weapons to Russia, but we didn't have these details. About a week before that, we had a report that a Ukrainian missile strike near Donetsk city on October 3rd killed 6 North Korean officers. And back in June, it was already reported that North Korea was going to send military construction and engineering forces to participate in, quote, reconstruction works in occupied Donetsk region. So it's very much part of a pattern. It's not confirmed yet, but you can see the context it fits into. I'm just going to move very quickly around the other parts of the front line. So, first of all, moving slightly clockwise, a little bit further east along the Russian, the Belgorod-Kharkiv region border, we have reports of a failed Russian attack, roughly platoon-sized, across the border directly north of Kharkiv city. Now that seems to be an attempt to relieve pressure on the westernmost of those 2 small salients the Russians managed to push into Kharkiv region across the border back in May, I think, actually, that haven't really gone very far. That seems to have been repelled by a Ukrainian drone unit from what we can see. The Russians are reported to have made a push in the Vovchansk area, which is the easternmost of those 2 little salients, little lodgements in the north of Kharkiv region. Going further east to that kind of eastern front that runs more or less directly north to south, Russia continues to attack towards Kupiansk. We have reports of attacks to the north, east and northwest of the city. And last night, Oleksiy Nabog, the governor of Kharkiv region, ordered the mandatory evacuation of Kupiansk, as well as Barova, a logistics hub further south in the region near Izium. He said the most difficult situation is in the Kupiansk sector on the east bank of the Oskil River, which divides the city. We can no longer guarantee the restoration of electricity, heat and water supply due to constant shelling. And just a reminder, Kupiansk, occupied by the Russians in the first part of the war, liberated by the Ukrainians in the autumn of 2022. God, it seems a long time ago now. The Russians have been pushing to get back there for months and months and months and months, and not making too much progress. But as we have reported, they have been slowly inching forward on that part of the front. We can move further down from Kupiansk as well. We've got reports of Russian attacks and incremental advances in the past day or so, further down that front, down towards Liman, towards the Siversk direction. They attacked in the area of a place called Herkno-Kamyansk. The attack apparently there was repelled. We have got reports of a Russian advance along the T-054 That's the Bakhmut to Konstantinovka highway. We're down in Donetsk region here, to the east of Chasiv Yar. Now, that road, I mean, that used to be the most direct road, obviously, to drive, into Bakhmut. So that means they're moving directly west towards the southern end of that fortress agglomeration. Konstantinovka, Slavyansk, Konstantinovka, Druzhkivka, and so on. Retakes near Chasiv Yar, we don't think there's really been much of a change in the front in Chasiv Yar, however. But the really big fight at the moment, as we've reported over the past few days, TETS, really confused reporting. I mean, we had there was the spokeswoman for one part of the Ukrainian military saying yesterday that, look, there is not a single building still standing or undamaged in TETS. It's basically been turned into a moonscape. And that means that cover has been lost. It's allowing the Russians to advance further. We've got really confused accounts of who controls what in the town. Just to give you an idea of it, it's a mining town. A lot of it's kind of built along a ridge, and the Russians seem to be trying to push their way kind of eastwards along the top of that ridge through the centre of town. Now we've had Denis Pushilin, who's the rather, I don't want to editorialise, but rather slimy Kremlin-appointed head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. He said that the Russians have captured 2/3 of it. The Institute for the Study of War says that they have assessed that the Russians have captured about less than 50%, maybe kind of 42% of it. I'm not sure how you quite calculate such an exact percentage of an urban area. And then the Centre for Defence Strategies, Ukrainian Defence Forces pushed out units of Russia's 132nd Separate Motorised Rifle Brigade and 51st Combined Arms Army from their positions in the centre of TETS. So I think the best thing we can say is really intense, confused urban fighting there. The Russians clearly putting in a big effort. We've had assessments for a while that the Ukrainians are expected to have to withdraw from that in due course, but we're not quite there yet. That's really the big thing at the moment. On the Pokrovsk direction, Russians continuing their offensive actions up and down. I'm not going to read out the full list of villages that listeners may not have heard. The best thing you can do is pull up the deep state map, have a look. The normal kind of story around there, I think on the whole, the thing to take away is that there's a huge amount of effort going into TETS, in a sense that they feel that once they take TETS, that is going to help them on these two other objectives they've got. The big objective of pushing in the Pokrovsk direction, the other objective of threatening the southern flank of the kind of fortress agglomeration just to the north of there. And just for a last little note, I may be wrong about this. However, listeners will have noted on Monday that we reported we'd seen the Russians really weirdly putting in an offensive, some kind of attack, way over the far western end of the front line where it meets the Dnipro River, a place called Kamyansk in Zaporizhzhia region. And we were wondering why that had happened. I'm not seeing any further reports or updates on them continuing to push there. It's still a bit of a mystery to me. If anyone has any ideas or so on, I'm very, very keen to know. But they have, the furthest west along that line that I'm seeing confirmed accounts of the Russians pushing today, at least, is over near Robotynya, Malatochmachka, south of Orikhiv, in that old battlefield from the counteroffensive. That, Francis, is pretty much, and I apologise for any holes in our coverage, but pretty much an overview of the battlefield situation today.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for that really in detail description of a very fast-moving situation, hence why it necessitated us going into a little bit more detail. And it's going to be the same in the political realm as well. Just before that, though, it is simply staggering to me that the prospect of North Korean troops serving to fight on European soil, perhaps as many as 10,000, that's a number that's being mooted this morning, and President Zelensky made reference to this story in his speech a few minutes ago, which I'll be going into, isn't a front-page story around the world. It has the potential to be one of the biggest escalations of the war so far, once again, from Russia and its allies, not the West. Moscow has trumpeted that there would be fierce consequences if Western troops were stationed on the ground in Ukraine. But where are the consequences for the Kremlin of doing the exact same thing? This would not just be the odd unit of soldiers recruited from Africa or India, something we've covered in the past, but potentially thousands of soldiers trained from a foreign army. Now, many will interpret this as evidence that the Russian army is strengthening. But as you say, Roland, another way of looking at it is that this is a clear indication that not is all dandy in the Russian armed forces. If it's dependent on the rogue government of Pyongyang for around half of its ammunition and now thousands of reinforcements, is that really what a successful military machine looks like? As Francis Farrell of the Kyiv Independent said after our conversation on air yesterday, the Russian army is beatable. That is clear to Ukrainian servicemen on the ground, which what makes the Western reticence even more baffling from their perspective. But more on that later. And indeed on the mood in Ukraine. But first, let's turn to that major political news of this morning. Within the past hour, President Zelensky has presented Ukraine's much debated victory plan to Parliament, albeit with some parts classified. The Kyiv Independent have done the best coverage on this so far. The proposal consists of 5 points. An invitation to join NATO, a defence aspect, deterrence of Russian aggression, economic growth and cooperation, and post-war security architecture. The plan also involves 3 secret addenda that have been shared with international partners, with the leader of the parliament saying the classified parts would be presented to faction leaders shortly. To quote from the president, "If the plan is supported, we can end the war no later than next year." Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi was also present, as was Bogdanov, head of the military intelligence, alongside Western diplomats in the parliament. Zelensky went on, "We understand that NATO membership is a matter for the future, not the present. But it is vital that we show Putin the error of his geopolitical calculations. We are a democratic nation that has proven it can protect our way of life." Now, the second article stresses the need to bring the war to Russian territory, such as during the cross-border Kursk incursion launched in August. This will prevent, he says, the creation of possible buffer zones on Ukrainian territory. The item also calls for the lifting of restrictions on long-range strikes in Russia, no surprise there, additional supplies of long-range capabilities and Western support in downing Russian missiles and drones over Ukraine, one of the most contentious parts given what's going on in Israel at the moment. Now, additional support in building up Ukrainian ground forces, he says, is vital, as is air defences, defence investment, intelligence assistance and other military aid that will strengthen Ukraine and dissuade the Russian population from their ideology of war. The third point refers to non-nuclear deterrence, one part of which will remain classified. Ukraine is proposing a comprehensive non-nuclear strategic deterrence package on its territory that would safeguard the country against future aggression. The fourth part addresses Ukraine's use of its natural resources, such as uranium, titanium and lithium, which present economic growth potential for Kyiv and the EU. Kyiv is also offering a special agreement on joint investment and use of these resources within the EU and the US. The further calls for the ramping up of sanctions against Russia to undermine its ability to sustain its aggression. Then the fifth part concerns Ukraine's post-war security architecture. Zelensky said Kyiv boasts a large and experienced military force that can strengthen NATO and the security of the entire European continent. He said, to conclude, if the partners agree, then after the war, we envisage replacing certain US military contingents stationed in Europe with Ukrainian units. If Putin achieves his insane geopolitical, military, ideological and economic goals, it will create an overwhelming impression for other potential aggressors, particularly in the Gulf region, the Indo-Pacific region and Africa. The wars of aggression can be profitable for them as well. We must implement the victory plan to force Russia to be at the peace summit and ready to end the war. So again, this is about laying the foundations for bringing Moscow to the table in conditions that are favourable to Ukraine. That is the best summary of the victory plan that we have heard so far, albeit without the classified segments. Its defenders will say that it clearly articulates that Kyiv does have a plan for how to create a pathway to victory if it gets requested Western support. Its detractors will argue that it is an overly optimistic shopping list which has little basis in reality at the present moment, with NATO membership not on the cards for the foreseeable, and it being unlikely for further weapons or permissions until after the US presidential election in 3 weeks' time. I think because of that, it is important to register here the mood of frustration. One might even say despair among some Ukrainians this week. There has been a notable mood shift, I think. So one former officer in the Ukrainian army, now an analyst, wrote on X as follows: "I'll say what many might think, but hesitate to voice. Ukraine is currently losing the war, and the trend is negative unless drastic measures are taken. Debates over what constitutes loss or victory can be had, and yes, Ukraine's survival so far is a big win. But even if Russia halts advances and goes on the defensive, we lack the resources to reclaim territories to the 2020 borders, let alone the 1991 borders. This is due to many factors: delayed mobilisation, insufficient aid, weak sanctions enforcement, a lack of political will in the West, poor military decisions, delayed aid due to de-escalation concerns, and the sheer reality of fighting a country with 4 times our population, with superior numbers in almost all domains, and one of the largest military industries supported by regimes like North Korea, which contribute more than some European countries with far larger GDPs. Manpower shortages are another issue, but that's a separate discussion. Ukrainian leadership bears a good part of the responsibility for these problems. Still, if the West can't supply the 14 brigades Zelensky requested, why discuss drafting hundreds of thousands more? We need to completely rearm way more existing brigades. Who's going to pay for them? Let's be honest, there's little enthusiasm in the US or Europe to fund this. Unless Ukraine and the West creates a serious plan to radically increase aid to support mobilisation, where Ukraine commits to mobilising more people on the condition that they are properly armed and trained, and the West provides robust air defence to intercept missiles, Ukraine will lose this war of attrition. This will force unfavourable peace and mass migration from Ukraine to other countries, setting a dangerous precedent and making it look like the West lost to Russia in the eyes of the world, especially among the enemies of the West. Some Western analysts mistakenly assume Russia has already failed in Ukraine, believing Ukraine just needs to maintain its pace until Russia is exhausted. This ignores the risk of internal crises in Ukraine and Russia offsetting its demographic losses with occupied Ukrainian territories. So that's one voice of a former Ukrainian army officer articulating frustration at the moment. Another voice, Timothy Mylyvinov, president of the Kyiv School of Economics and Minister of Finance 2019-2020, also been on the podcast in the past, puts it as follows: "I am back in Ukraine and the mood is pitch black. Ukraine feels betrayed." He then goes on to reference the Rusi article I quoted from yesterday, talking about the danger of a betrayal of Ukraine by the West. He says the Rusi article is softer than the reality on the ground in Kyiv and across Ukraine. Russian attacks on civilians have escalated, and the coming winter threatens prolonged blackouts. Some consider leaving, but males face strict mobilisation. Many expect to be drafted. While some are forced into service, others look for ways to hide or escape. Russia is advancing with no signs of willingness to negotiate. In this context, talks of peace, ceasefires or deals feel completely detached from reality. Western fatigue is palatable. Many just want the war to disappear. This view is delusional. Russia isn't going anywhere. It's here to stay and aims to destabilise Europe. If Ukraine falls, the security in Europe will become dire. What's needed is meaningful financial and military support for Ukraine. This will only happen if Western thinking shifts from fearing escalation to recognising the existential need to contain Russia by force. So that there is the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, as I say. This is me now. Anyone who is complacent as to what a Russian victory would mean should read the series of essays we published in June by international commentators on the implications for the West. That is including a influx of Ukrainian refugees, the seizure of vast territory and resources Putin could use to escalate hybrid warfare deeper into Europe, mass war crimes against the Ukrainian civilian population, and China and Russia emboldened in their plan to subvert the US as a preeminent world power. And that's before we even get into the horrors that Ukraine itself would endure, not least in Kyiv, no doubt. We'll add a link in the show notes to those, but it is very sobering, those reflections. And I would urge those listening in Europe and in the United States to really reflect on the situation at the moment. A more optimistic view would say, and it is important, I think, to inject this in here, given the despair at the moment, that many would argue the front lines are set to freeze over autumn and winter, with minimal gains for Moscow being possible. They would argue that this is the last major push before November. Likewise, the new NATO head, Mark Rutte, is in place now and will want to make his mark. He's emphasised this week that he will ensure personally that Ukraine gets what it needs to prevail, his words. Likewise, once the US election takes place, as I say, whichever way the result goes, Western policy that is currently paused will restart, either with a continuation or increase of support for Kyiv from Washington, or a suggestion of a withdrawal of support, in which case Europe will have to respond if it is serious about the consequences of Ukrainian defeat. So it is vital to just remember that, and also the historical lesson that sometimes holding on is enough. Suddenly, circumstances can change very quickly. Internal chaos, something going wrong with Putin's health, another major commander suddenly having something going seriously wrong, another incursion like Kursk, which suddenly changes the nature of the conversation. It is not all predestined negativity at this point on, but it is important to register the severity of the situation as viewed from the ground. Now, I've been talking for long enough. It is a real honour to welcome to the studio Lieutenant Yulia Mykytenko of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and her biographer Lara Marlowe, author of that biography, How Good It Is, I Have No Fear of Dying. Now, Yulia, I'll come to you in a moment, but Lara has very kindly offered, first of all, to introduce your extraordinary story and offer just a brief summary of your amazing life so far. So, Lara, thank you very much for coming in, and I've read the book over the last couple of days, so I'm really looking forward to talking to Yulia about her experiences. But first of all, if you could just provide a summary of the extraordinary experiences that she has had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a great fan of Ukraine, the latest. I first met Yulia remotely by Zoom. I was in Kyiv in August of 23, and she was in her frontline position in Donbass. And I just, one is rushing around from appointment to appointment, and I hadn't studied up. And I said, "Oh, are you the woman drone pilot?" And she said, "I am not." She said, "I am the commander of a platoon of 25 men." So I stood corrected. And in the course of the interview, I learned more about her biography. Yulia is 29 years old today. She was born in Kyiv in 1995. Not today, her birthday, but she was 29 in July. She had a difficult childhood. The 1990s, as you know, were a period of terrible economic crisis in Ukraine. Her parents divorced. She went to Kyiv-Mohyla University, which is the oldest in Ukraine, and it is also a place that defends very much Ukrainian identity. She had been a Russian speaker up to then, and it was at Kyiv-Mohyla that she embraced Ukrainian nationalism, language, history, and in particular the works of Hilovy, whose slogan was "Get away from Moscow" back in the 1920s and early 30s. And she was one of the founding members of the Women's Sotnya, or unit, in the Maidan defense brigades in November of 2013. She was there on the Maidan every day of those 3 months, which was really a turning point in Ukrainian history. And the following year, she met her husband, Ilya Serbin. He was a soldier. They met and fell in love and married within 3 months. He was, as I said, was a soldier. She joined the army on graduating from Kyiv-Mohyla in 2016. So she's been in the Ukrainian armed forces continuously since 2016, except for a 6-month period when she left after Ilya's death. And he was killed in a Russian bombardment near Svitlodarsk in February of 2018. And 2 years later, Yulia suffered another terrible tragedy, which was that her father, who was a master sergeant in the Ukrainian National Guard, self-immolated on the Maidan because he believed that the Steinmeier formula was a capitulation to Russia, that Kyiv, his last words actually before he died were that I want Ukraine to be independent. So Yulia's known great tragedy, but I was just utterly astounded by her courage, her determination. She was awarded the Medal for Courage in 2022, October 2022. On the first day of the first-scale invasion, she got her mother to drive her to the recruitment center in the suburbs of Kyiv. She rejoined. She'd been out for just 6 months. She spent 3 months on patrol in Kyiv Oblast, including going to the town where she lived as a small child, of Bucha, where her childhood nanny's husband had been shot dead by the Russians. In June of 2022, she was redeployed to Donbass, to her same brigade that she'd been with before, and she was given the command of a reconnaissance unit. So she's been in Donbass continuously since June of 2022, and she just left her frontline position near Liman on Saturday, 3 days ago. And has been working sort of remotely from London, believe it or not, handling administrative things within her platoon, the movement of one dugout and redeployment of a soldier who'd been wounded and so on. So I'll let you talk to Yulia.
Thank you very much for that, Lara. Yulia, it is a real honour to have you here in the Telegraph and to meet you in person after reading the extraordinary experiences that you've had, and listeners will have heard them there. Let's start then on where you were a few days ago at the front. What was the mood like there, and what were you working on? I know that drones are a major subject for you, so perhaps you could talk about what your experience has been like on drones and the very latest with drone warfare. I know there are lots of types of drones at the moment.
First of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be and chat with you. About the state right now, it's like stable, hard but stable. About drones, there are actually I wouldn't say that there are many of them, but I think that we had a great evolution from 2016 when I was in the army. We can talk about some of them. Most popular is Mavics, it's just civilian drones, which we are using for observing. It's not a secret. And also FPV drone, it means first personal view drones, which we are using basically as bombers, like an artillery, sort of cheaper sort of artillery, to reject Russian tanks and armor vehicles when they are attacking our positions, and also to injure their infantry. And also we have like a big agro drones, which we are using for now. Usually we are using them to put some grenades on infantry of the enemy, but for now we are using them to bring a supply to the infantry, because sometimes it's quite hard for infantry to bring some supplement for themselves. I mean, food or water. So we just bring them this with these big agro drones. And also we have unmanned aircraft vehicles for reconnaissance.
Fascinating. And why did you decide to work with drones? We've understood that it's become a very popular recruitment tool for various different units because of the fascination of the technology and everything else. I wonder why you personally got involved in them and the changes that you've seen over your time of service.
I became a troop commander in 2017, and it was a reconnaissance unit. And actually, in that period of time, I've already knew that the war must be like going on with techniques, but not with people. Personal for me, since I've studied at university, which like humanity and human rights, I think that the human life is the most precious that we have, and which is why I always insisted to make war with the drones and with technologies, but not with the humans. It's like a very post-Soviet thought that we should use more people. I was always against that. I was using drones, and my unit, it was like a very small unit, not as big as it's now. But in 2017, this topic with drones was not very popular. But I thought that this is an opportunity to preserve my small amount of people, and which is why in that period of time I've already been using. In that time, it was popular Mavic DJI Phantom. We were using that also for researching and reconnaissance. And also, I have a small aircraft, unmanned aircraft vehicle. Yes, a small one. We still use it in our for now in a frontline. But now we also have much better one. But in that period of time, that drone was very popular and very nice. So I was using it also.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Well, you say in your book, and I'm paraphrasing here, that in a sense your life so far mirrors the birth of Ukraine itself as a sovereign nation. And of course, you've seen a lot of tribulations over that time, including Maidan. I would just wonder, when you reflect on your life so far and you see the cycle that Ukraine has gone through, how would you summarize the experience that Ukrainians have gone through in terms of their own sense of national identity?
I think we are growing up. We are finding our way to be an independent and strong country, and this is quite not a good, but also not in a bad way to find ourselves in this big world. We just building ourselves as a nation, as a state, as an independent country. And there is Ukrainian quote that I know the. I know the power of the freedom. This is Ukrainian quote, so I think it's our way to be democratic country.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Now, Maidan, of course, we've referred to today, and your memories of that time would be very, very interesting. Maidan is something we have covered many times on the podcast with people who were there alongside you in the streets of Kyiv, recalling the moment. When you reflect on its importance for what followed in terms of Ukrainian identity, do you think it was the critical turning point, or do you think perhaps that this war is the biggest turning point in terms of the creation of the Ukrainian state, because this is in a sense a war of liberation? I'm interested in your perspective on those two events.
I think it's actually both. First one, we felt ourselves like Ukrainians. It was at Maidan. You just have some feelings that you have the right and you have a chance to change something in your country, and you have all right to do that. And this give us a wave of sense of our identity, and I think that because of Maidan, we had enough strength to resist on the east of Ukraine and in Crimea. So I think that it's like points which are connected.
That's interesting. Thank you. Now, we also on this podcast have spoken to people about, many journalists who spent time at the front line, talking about the way in which women have been serving in the armed forces. It's perhaps an underappreciated aspect of the conflict. And so I'm very interested in your perspective as a woman fighting for your country, and the way in which perhaps women's role in Ukrainian society has shifted as a consequence of the war. Very interested in your perspective on that.
Actually, I can compare it. I started in 2016 and I mobilized again in 2022. And actually, there are some difference between how I was in the army in 2016 and also in 2022. Actually, I think that Ukrainian army passed a big way of evolution in that way, because in 2016 everyone was very surprised and wondering, and it would be more natural if dinosaurs came to the army than sorry about that. And now for me it was quite natural to join the army. Of course, I caught some very surprising sights on me. And also when I came to a recruitment center in 2022, I had a pink hair. So a lot of men were very surprised to see me in that. Yeah, now I have a blue one. but my boys already got used to my extravagant way. So they were quite surprised, but not shocked. And for me, it was quite more easy to be on a combat position than it was in 2016. So I think, and basically in Ukraine, we've already have Ukrainian uniform. Women female uniform and female flag jacket. Yeah. So I think it's great progression, like in a few years. I think some armies go to that 10 years and more, and we did that in a few years. So I think we're doing great in that.
Yes, we've covered the women's uniforms and the changes that have happened there. I think it was with Svetlana Morinets a few months ago. So really interesting to hear that clarified from somebody who's experiencing it. I have a sensitive question before I bring in Roland, Yulia, which is, you, of course, as Lara just described there, you've lost your husband, your father, and your brother-in-arms as a consequence of the war or events connected to it. Do you ever have moments of doubt about whether Ukraine should keep fighting? And how do you keep morale high when you go through such hardship over such a prolonged period of time?
I have any doubts at all. The sense of the feelings of our losses, they don't demoralize us, but maybe make us stronger, because we have much more things to fight for. I don't want to let my husband and my father, because I think that they rely on me very much. So I just don't want to
let them down.
Yeah, let them down because of me. So I will fight as much as I can.
Thank you. And one final question before I pass over to Roland. This is something I've heard some Ukrainians say to me, which is that they worry that Ukraine is losing some of its best citizens in this war. And that's something that won't be alien to many listeners who look back on wars that their own countries have experienced, where there have been many of their youngest individuals killed as a consequence of a horrific war in the past. I wonder, in what way do you think that the sacrifice that those soldiers have made will have an impact on the next generation? Is it something that the next generation and young people growing up today are already very, very aware of, the sacrifice that has been made for them and perhaps the responsibility that comes with that? I'm very interested in the idea that with their sacrifice, something positive can come. I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Maybe this is the only one thing that really depressed me. It's the thought that we really lose a huge amount, really brilliant people. Unfortunately, I used to know some of them. It's some artists and poets who were actually a friend of mine, and this is really painful. I can't say about the next generation, but I am pretty sure that I will demand from them to give their respect and live a decent life, in case if I stay alive.
Thank you, Yulia. Roland, I'll come to you just in a moment, but it's so interesting what you said there about the reference to artists. I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but Robert Hughes, the great historian of art, once asked a very passionate question, which I think speaks to this, which is people ask, where is Britain's, say, Picasso? And then he points in the documentary to Tik Tok Monument, which is naming the soldiers who were killed in just one battle of the First World War. And he says the chances are that they are on there. And it's just something to bear in mind when we reflect on the staggering loss that Ukraine is enduring at the moment. So I just wanted to mention that. But Roland, you've been listening, and I'm sure that you have some questions for Yulia and for Lara as well.
Can I start with quite a difficult one? I mean, it's quite tough, and I'm interested in your view of it as commander of a drone unit. So we saw over the weekend these reports of a number of Ukrainian prisoners of war being murdered in Kursk region, allegedly from a drone unit. And there's two aspects to that I wanted to ask you about. One is the aspect that they were apparently, they were a drone unit, they were meant to be behind the front, they would presumably felt they were relatively safe. So I wanted to ask you about how dangerous is that for you guys to be overrun. But the second thing is that I read a lot of the reaction on the Russian war blogger community. And they had this, a lot of them were saying things like, we know these guys are extremists, right? These are quite nasty warlike people, but they were saying things like, it serves them right, we hate drone operators, the rule used to be you never take snipers prisoner, you never take pilots prisoner, but now in the modern world the rule is never take a drone pilot prisoner, because they all hate FPV drone pilots because it's so terrifying. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, if that is something you're aware of, if that is a reality that you guys face.
Actually, we can connect these two questions. There is no safe place in the front line. So yeah, I can feel that for now, pilot drones, they're like target number one of the first ones. The shelling is increasingly on my pilots, so I need to sometimes move them around and do it as more quiet than hide them as much as I can. There is always a possibility to be imprisoned by Russians or to get caught, and which is why I always insist my pilots training on the training range, not only like technical stuff, but also shooting, also some military stuff. I mean, they should know how to move together in case if they're too dangerous, how to left the positions in a right way, not to be bombarded with the artillery. I put an attention on that for their trainings, and I always told. Actually, they know all what is going on the front line, and when you spend a lot of time there, you just have feelings how it's going on. So you have some feelings when you should move back, so not to be caught or shelled or whatever. And the second question about Kursk region, I think that there might be possible because in some front lines, the front line is very dynamic, and it's quite hard to see what's going on next. Fortunately, on my front line, it's quite stable all the time. I mean, we can predict the enemies. Almost the same enemies' actions, so I can make decisions that will preserve my pilots.
And on that question of the sense that drone pilots are particularly hated by the infantry on either side, do you think, is that true, do you think?
As you can see, I think that you are know more than me due to frontline. As far as you can see, for now, they don't take prisoners at all. So it's not only concerns of infantry or drone pilots. It may also concern artillerists also. I think that they don't take prisoners because it's quite hard to put them in the safe zone for now.
Another question about Russians, really. I'm wondering. We know that this whole war has, in a way, been about the evolution of the high-tech war, of the drone warfare on both sides. And I remember, I haven't actually been to Ukraine for a while now, but on my last trip, back in, what was it, the summer or September of 2023, I remember the first time when I was going out, friends in Kyiv were saying, listen, you've got to be really careful now because there are Russian FPV drones everywhere looking for everything. We had Francis Farrellin, who's a journalist who works there a lot, and he said, look, it's like he was finding it almost impossible to get within kind of 10 kilometers of Pokrovsk because of the movement on the roads and stuff. Do you find yourself in a direct kind of competition with your, presumably there's a Russian analogue of you, maybe it's not a woman, commanding a drone unit, just a few miles that way. Do you get a sense of who that person is or their characters, or do you find yourself directly competing with an enemy drone unit over the front and trying to learn their tricks and adjust to their tricks and things like that?
Actually, yeah, sort of. Sometimes we have trophy drones, and we just and we disassemble it and try to figure out how it works to improve our drones. And I think that they do the same thing. It's sort of a race. I don't know who is the winner now. I think the time will show. But for now, I think that we are maybe on the same level. I think so. They a little bit have advantage in an amount, but we are also maybe some have an advantage about the quality.
Thank you very much. And last question again about being a woman in the military. I just want to know because you're a lieutenant, right?
Senior.
A senior lieutenant. So you're an officer in charge of. How many men, if it's not a secret?
25.
25 guys. They're all men.
That would be, yeah.
How has that been? I mean, do you have trouble stamping your authority on this unit? Or, just tell us a bit about that, because you're remarkably young to be doing that anyway, really. And in a combat role, and you're a woman. I'm just fascinated about what that's like. And are there any other women in the unit or other female officers who you can kind of exchange notes with?
I don't have much acquaintance of mine who is a woman and an officer. Maybe there are just few of them, and most of them they're working with the documents. Actually, most of them they are commanding evacuation units, small groups. I had quite a lot of time just to earn their respect and trust to me. And I think it's quite normal practice that when you came to a new unit, they know each other, but they don't know you. It's like you come to a new job and you just have to somehow recommend yourself. So I think it's very similar to the civilian life when you came to work in a new company. But I need to. It took me few months to earn their respect and trust, and for that I need to be with them on the positions all the time. I always go first. I always made a reconnaissance first, working with them all the time. and only after that I got some respect and authority. So they are like they listen to me with no doubts, and if I will tell them to go there, they will go with no questions. So it take a lot of time, but it definitely worth it. And actually, I have much more disrespect from high rank officers.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I have no problems with the soldiers and with surgeons. I mean, with those people who are right on the front line or who have experience in a battlefield, because they know that there is no gender on the battlefield. There is only your skills and only your trainings, and that's all. That's what is actually matter. But officers, high ranks, they're usually not very involved on the front line. And usually they sometimes they can show their disrespect with some inappropriate jokes. I wouldn't say that it's like a very sexual harassment or whatever. No, I've never faced with that actually. Maybe I'm very lucky because I have a very good guys to serve with. But yeah, sometimes it's like very stupid jokes. And for example, when I first came in 2017 to command a reconnaissance unit, when I came to a headquarters for a briefing, one officer, a company commander, he asked me, "Are you not afraid? They're shelling right there." And the interesting point is that he's not mobilized in 2022, and he actually wasn't on the front line. So when I hear something like that, I just know that this person have never been on the front line, and he just doesn't worth my respect and my attention. So I just don't pay attention on that.
Well, thank you very much, Yulia, for your honesty and your fascinating insights today. It brings me now to our final thoughts, where we offer everybody an opportunity to talk about what's on their mind that may not be on ours or that we haven't covered today. Lara, if I could start with you. You have been listening to all of this, and I'm very aware that you've, of course, had to write Yulia's biography. And I'm just interested perhaps in your final thought, as well as to anything else you would like to add, in the process of writing this and why you felt it was so important to record Yulia's story.
I think it was partly because I felt that her life really mirrored the history of independent Ukraine, as Roland said. She represented something to me. She seemed really a microcosm of the Ukrainian experience. And she's been writing, and we've been autographing copies of our book, How Good It Is, I Have No Fear of Dying. And she writes in the front of each book, "Fight like a Ukrainian." And I think that Ukraine and the Ukrainians who are fighting for their lives and for their country have something to teach us. Yulia said to me this morning that the West needs another Winston Churchill. They need someone courageous and determined and who will see what's right and do it. And it just escapes me. I cannot understand how people like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, for example, how they cannot see the importance of this conflict, and that if they don't stand up to Russia now, they're going to be fighting. This will be the last war in which NATO troops are not fighting. I really believe that. And I'm filled with despair at the prospect of a Trump victory. Utter despair. I think we've got to help Ukraine. And I'm hoping that Yulia's message, that this book that we've written together, will inspire public opinion in the West, will make people see how absolutely essential it is that we do that.
Well, thank you very much, Lara, for your thoughts there. Roland, I'd like to go to Yulia last. So what do you want to leave our listeners with?
I'm going to be very, very quick. You all have mentioned, we were speaking a while ago about this big debate in Australia about whether they should send tanks, and people banging the table over there and saying, what the hell is the government doing? We've got these old Abrams, we're not sending them. Well, Australian Broadcasting Corporation website. It's 1 hour ago, which is why I missed this, and this was not in our military update earlier. I apologise. Dozens of soon-to-be retired Australian Abrams tanks will be sent to Ukraine under a $245 million military support package. So these are the aging M1A1 fleet. Australia's retiring that. They're receiving the newer version from the Americans. That's why they're retiring it. So the Australian government is saying it is gifting 49 of these to Ukraine. So there is a conclusion to that story that we were talking about. And I know we had Australian General Mick Ryan on talking to Dom earlier. So there you are. That's I suppose a bit of positive news. And that is where I will leave you right now. I'll pass on to Yulia.
Well, no doubt that will be an update that will be greatly appreciated by many of our Australian listeners. We always appreciate our messages from the other side of the world that we receive. We know there are so many of you, and often they are lamenting the decisions made by the Australian government. So a little bit of light there. But Yulia, it's been so fascinating talking to you and reading about your experiences. I hope that listeners around the world will appreciate your story today. But what do you want to leave them with?
Oh my, I always confused when somebody asks me about that. I think, as Lara said, just be brave and fight for what you are considered to be right. I think everyone has its feeling what is right and what is wrong, and just have enough strength to insist on your right opinion. I think that would be all.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Yulia. Thank you, Lara. Thank you to everyone else who's also in the studio who's been able to facilitate today. Kate and, of course, Yulia's fantastic translator who was helping there as well. Thank you all for your time. And thank you, Roland, as well. I would be remiss not to miss off Mr. Oliphant. It goes for me to say, of course, that this will be a podcast later on, slightly polished. I don't think we'll need any new content today because it's such a fascinating and in-depth interview. But as ever, it's worth listening to that and easier to share too. That'll be out in a few hours' time, and we will be back, of course, tomorrow at 1 p.m. London time. I'll be at Chatham House in the morning seeing a very important official, but I still plan to tune in and be able to contribute some thoughts from that. So we look forward very much to see you then. Thank you all, and goodbye for now. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/studentsub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Adimora. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.